All right, and we're back. All right, my name is Brandon Salter. I identify as he, him. I identify as white. I am brand new to Greenwood Elementary. I'm happy to be a Greenwood star. I've been at Adams Elementary for most of my career. Big ups to both schools. All right, I'm going to end today by talking about how do we value students' intersectional identities. Hopefully you had a chance to check out these quotes here from Christina Torres. I'm just going to go through and read both of them though for you. When I don't consider intersectionality, I run the risk of oppressing my kids. When we stop seeing our kids as whole people, as nuanced people with context to gender and race and class, we stop seeing them as real people. Seeing your students as more than just a thing that stands out in the classroom as far as race or their gender, and understanding that there's a long background to all of those things. So, Laura, Ray, all the folks on the committee today, we're talking about why are we centering race when we're thinking about intersectional identities? Well, the big reason is that because we live in a culture that values white supremacy, that is built on white supremacy. We are one of the few race-based slave societies in the history of the world. White folks are benefiting from the work and enslavement of black and brown folks. So that is why we are focusing on race when we're thinking about intersectionality, because it really defines and shapes the way that we as educators work with our students, not only in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. So I've worked in schools long enough to know that a lot of times educators, they view students for their most visible identity, right? That might be their race, that might be that they're ELL, that might be that they're special education. And it behooves us as educators to start thinking about valuing and recognizing all of their identities and how they intersect. As we saw the work that Ray and Laura presented earlier, the importance of intersectionality and how we're working with our students is so important. We need to make sure that we are capitalizing on our students' strengths, and when we see them as one or two things, we often miss out on their strengths and pigeonhole them into categories that don't allow them to thrive in our classrooms. This is especially important when we're thinking about that SEL work that Ray talked about earlier, that we are thinking, how do we weave through the SEL work throughout the course of the day and not in just to our 20 or 30 minute opener, right? How are we valuing our students' identities throughout math, throughout ELA, throughout science, throughout PE, music, art? What are we doing to see their strengths? How are we undoing that amygdala hijack that keeps students from learning throughout the course of the day? You know, you think about Zaretta Hammond's culture tree and culturally responsive teaching in the brain. We think a lot of us are just looking at that top culture, right? The leaves, the things, their language. We need to start thinking about that shallow culture and the deep culture that really defines students and who they are. And it behooves us to get to know students and families so that we're able to teach them in an anti-racist way. All right, I have a short video here from Teaching Tolerance. It's a basic introduction to intersectionality, just thinking about how do we value students as we work through the day. I'm going to go ahead and play this now.
Intersectionality. Have you heard
Intersectionality.
Even
have
if
you
you
heard
have,
this word before?
you might not know what it means.
Even if you have,
Let's take a
you
look
might
at
not
it.
know what it means.
The first part's
Let's
easy
take a
enough.
look at it. The
Intersection.
first part's easy
A
enough.
place where things come
Intersection.
together.
A place where things come together.
Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all
Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of black women are different from the experiences of black men and of white women.
Black women
How?
gender discrimination.
Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving, and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read our story, Teaching at the Intersections, in the summer 2016 issue of Teaching Tolerance magazine.
All right. I'm actually going to postpone this self-reflection. We're not going to do it right now, but I am going to go through the questions, and I want you to think about these with the next thing that I'm going to talk to you about. But I want you to be thinking about, as an educator, whether that's a classroom teacher, administrator, a paraprofessional, you all work with students, custodian. What values or intersectional identities have been hard for you to see, acknowledge, or support with your students, right? We all have our own identities. The school system has an identity. Your building has an identity. But what are ones that have been hard for you to see, acknowledge, or support with your students? And why do you think that is? Why is it hard for you to see those things? The second thing that I really want you to be thinking about as we move through the school year, as we are enduring, a dual pandemic, right? We're thinking about COVID-19. We're thinking about the racism crisis in America. This dual pandemic. What are you committing to do this year to help ensure that all your students feel like their intersectional identities are honored and valued within your classroom and school community? Right? This is different than it is. We're not going to be in the four walls of a building anymore. We're going to be remote. This is an opportunity for you to rethink the way that you teach, right? You can turn this into an anti-racist teaching platform. This is your opportunity to do things differently. We're not returning to normal. This is new, all right? So we're pushing and challenging all of you to be thinking about how are you going to do things differently to really honor your intersectional identities of your students and their families this year. So this is the big ask that we are asking you to do. Flor Del Rio talked earlier about accountability buddy, an accomplice. So we really want you to think about how are you going to hold each other accountable and do this anti-racism work, this intersectionality work, identity work, dismantling racial contracts that we're talking about in the first session. So we want you to think about finding someone in your building, your department, that is going to help hold you accountable for doing that work, right? I'm really going to encourage you to find someone you don't know well or is not on your team. And the reason being is that you end up talking about things, you talk about friendship stuff, right? Find someone that maybe you don't know very well, and you're going to be more accountable to them. If you reference the guiding document that was sent out this weekend, there's a list of questions that can help frame some of your conversations. Obviously, there's a million other things you can be thinking about, but if you need some inspiration, there's a list of questions. And also, after the list of questions, there are some resources that might help you think about identity and intersectionality in a new way. Our ask is that you meet with this person at least one time in the coming weeks, but really we would love it if you could have a monthly check-in with that person. What types of readings are you doing? What are you changing in your classroom? How are you interacting differently with families than you normally would? How are you pushing yourself on this racial journey that we're part of, okay? So just to end here, I want us to be thinking about what are we doing to ensure that all of our students are thriving in this environment, right? What am I doing as a white male to undo racism in my classroom? How am I making sure that I'm not putting this work on the backs of BIPOC folks, right? That I'm doing the work, that I'm challenging my colleagues to do the work, that I am seeking out resources, that we're standing up for folks, right? That we're not letting racist comments slide in the classroom or in staff meetings. We're standing up to folks and saying what's right, right? This work, self-identity work, is going to transform the way that SEL happens. If you don't know yourself, you can't teach SEL, right? And the same is going to go for your students. If you know yourself well and you're able to think about and talk about that hopefully you can help your students know themselves well. So we're going to wrap up for today. We really appreciate you sticking with us. I know this has been a long day, long time in front of the computer.